Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my channel. My name is Fredrik Strand Oseberg, and today we are going to have a look at how you can build a chatbot with React Chatbot Kit. Now, this is a package that I made as a part of a cloud computing course. I kind of want to merge my front-end expertise with learning about backend and serverless functions, and I ended up building a chatbot and extrapolating that into an npm package. We're going to look at that today and see how we can make some pretty interesting interfaces. So I think we're just going to jump right in, and I've done a little bit of setup here. So I have here a blank create React app project, and I've deleted almost everything inside of app.js. We just have the container with a class name of app and a container for the chatbot that I've just lazily styled with the max width. We've also done a few changes to the CSS so that the background of the app container just now spans the entire height of the browser window. And that gives us just this blank canvas that we can start painting on. So if you haven't set it up and you want to do that, you can pause the video and we'll get started with building the chatbot up next. So let's go to app.js, and if you haven't got Yarn, you can use npm, but open up your terminal built-in in VS Code or iTerm if you use that, and use the command yarn add react chatbot kit. Now I already have this installed. It's already in node modules in this project, so I don't need to run the command, but you do. And once it's installed, you can go to the top of app.js and import the chatbot component. And once we have that, we'll put it in this container. All right, so just heading back to the browser for a second. This is the first view that we get when we put the chatbot in, like we did just now. So this screen just lets us know that we are missing some vital props in order to get the chatbot to work. And it also gives us a link to the documentation. So we are going to just go and click the link, and we'll have a look at the documentation as well. So right off the bat, we have an overview here on the page with a gist that gives us a clue to what we need to do in order to get the chatbot to work. We also have a working instance of the chatbot here on the right hand side that we can use to kind of, if we are curious about any other pieces of the chatbot, we can navigate through this one and get some answers here as well. So it works as kind of an introduction and overview to how the data flows through the chatbot and information about the different parts. And you can also scroll down. There's more information that goes more in depth in the documentation, but for now we are going to follow this link that gives us kind of some boilerplate that we can use. So under quick start, there is a link to a gist. Go ahead and open that, and we should have all we need to get started. So let's go back to the editor, and we'll just create a config, a message parser, and an action provider. So let's go ahead and create those files. I'm going to put them in a chatbot folder. So I created a config.js and I want a message parser.js and I want an action provider.js. And I can go ahead and go back to my browser window. And I want to let's grab the message parser first. Make sure to get all of it. And I want to delete this because that's just a placeholder for the parse logic. Instead, we can put console log message here. So next, I want to grab the config. Go ahead and paste that in. And finally, I want to grab the action provider. And go ahead and paste that in too. So now we should have all the pieces that we need to get started. So let's head over to app.js and start importing all of these things. And I'm just using my plugin here that helps me locate and import modules. And let's put them up here. And we will feed them into the chatbot. Whoops. All right. So if we head back to our browser now, we should be able to see the chatbot working, and it does. So now we have it up and running, and we kind of have just a basic hello world message from the chatbot. So if we try to write in the input field here, that'll work. And we can render it to the screen, but obviously there's no response because we haven't configured any actions in the chatbot yet. But it's up and running, so that's good. So let's just take a brief look at the different pieces, and then we'll go ahead and do something more interesting. So in the config, basically, it's just a JavaScript file with a list of configurable properties for the chatbot. So another thing we could give it here is bot name. So let's call it learning bot. And it has a initial messages array, and it uses a helper function from React Chatbot Kit that kind of creates a message object. You can create it from scratch, but it's much easier just to use this helper function. So that's basically the config. You can do lots more with it. You can inject state, you can register widgets, you can swap out components, you can add, change the color of different components. It's all documented in the documentation, so you can go ahead and have a look there of every configurable property. But let's have a look at the message parser and the action provider. So, all right, so the message parser is kind of the component that handles actually parsing user input. So whenever a user types something into the input field and hits send, the message is picked up and run through this message parser. And that kind of means that you are free to implement a very complex message parser or a very simple message parser. Completely dependent on your needs. But every message is run through this parse message. So all the logic needs to be implemented there. But you're free to kind of structure it in any way you want inside of that parameter or inside those kind of frames. And as we can see in the constructor, it also receives the action provider. And the action provider is what we'll use to update the internal state of the chatbot. So inside of the action provider, we have create chatbot message and we have set state, where set state is a function that is passed from the chatbot component and injected into the action provider that you provide. So when you give this class to the chatbot, this class is initialized inside of the chatbot and injected these two things. So we'll take a look at now how we can actually make this work, just a simple hello world example at first. So let's go to the message parser and we'll take the message and we'll lowercase it to lowercase, and we'll just do a simple check if lowercase includes hello. Then we want to do this action provider greet. All right, so this won't work right now because we haven't implemented the greet function, because we need to do that in our action provider. So let's go over to the action provider and we'll create a greet method, and we'll also create a add chatbot to states. All right, let's shorten that a little bit, which will take a message. All right, so what do we want to do in greet? Well, we want to create a message and we want to use this create chatbot message and we want to say hello friend. And now this will create the message object for us, and we want to take that message object and we want to update the chatbot state. And to do that, we need to use the setState function. But we also need to be mindful of the fact that we have access to the entire chatbot state through this function. So we always need to make sure that we are preserving the previous state when we are updating. So let's go ahead and do this setState. We'll take the previous state, which is a React, something that React gives us. We'll spread that. So we're copying the previous state over. And now we want to do messages. And we want to copy the previous state messages over, and we'll add the new message at the end. All right, so now we have a way to update the chatbot state, and we'll go ahead and use this helper method here, and we'll pass in the message. All right, so hopefully now, if we've done everything correctly, we'll be able to get a response in the chatbot once we type in hello. It was hello, right? Yeah. All right, so let's have a look. Hello. And we can see we get a response from the chatbot. Perfect. So that worked, but it's not particularly interesting. I do have something more interesting that we are going to be looking at next. And I cheated a little bit. I made these components yesterday, and I actually filmed doing it, but it became very long, and I did the raw footage, kind of like figuring it out on the fly. So it didn't turn out as well as I wanted it to be. But I have the components now, and just to keep this as short as possible, I wanted to just show you how you can implement them and not actually build out the components in this video. If you think that's interesting, then that's certainly something that we can do in another video. But for now, I think I'm just going to show how we can get the finished components on the screen. So I have two things here. So on the left hand side, we have two components. One is a options component, which is something that I like to do in my chatbots that I build. I just render some options with the first message, so that I kind of guide the user to what's possible to do within the chatbot. If you want, you can skip that and you can build as complex message parsing logic as you like. But for me, it's worked pretty well just to give some basic options and build out the necessary functionality to get that to work. So basically what these options do is that they render some buttons to the screen, and they get a handler from the action provider, so we can actually trigger actions from inside the options. Now, this leads me into another concept that I need to explain in the config and in the chatbot in general, because the chatbot works by updating the messages array in the chatbot with a chatbot message object, and you can actually render custom components with a chatbot message. So you can build a React component, and you can say when you create the chatbot message that you want to display a component with this message. And that opens up basically anything you want to do within the chatbot. You can, because you can build custom components, you can retrieve data, you can build custom widgets that you just inject into the chatbot window. So we're going to do that now. We're going to register the options component as a widget, and we are going to render it with our first message. So we are going to head over to the documentation again. So over here, and we are going to go down to widgets here, and we're just going to grab this first object. And we'll go back to the config, and we'll add widgets, and it's going to be an array, and we're going to add this object. We'll remove this because we don't need it right now. And we are going to import the options component. And we need, of course, to have React in scope. All right. And let's call this options. So, all right. What do we do now? Because I can understand that it can be confusing, but basically we're just registering components inside of the chatbot, and we're giving it a name that we can refer to it by. and we're giving it a function to render it. And the reason that we're giving it as a function is because we are injecting our widgets with props. That's how we get access to the action provider. So, you know, the action provider, when you pass it to the chatbot, it's a class, so it's not initialized yet. And it doesn't have, it's not an instance, it's just a class. So we need to instantiate it inside of the chatbot and then pass it to our widgets through there. So that's why we give these widgets as functions, because we can inject them with more functionality that we need. So we've called this options, and we basically registered it now. So React Chatbot Kit will take this and it will register it inside a internal widget registry. And that means that we can now refer to it through create chatbot message. So basically this options component is rendering out a list of programming languages, and we want to, when we click on them, we want something to happen. And in this case, we are going to be displaying a kind of a flashcard component, and the flashcard component will just show some questions about the programming language, and you'll have the ability to jump to the next question until the flashcard, until the questions run out. So we have a method here. We'll get back to that and what that means. But first, let's go back to the config and we'll say, hello, what do you want to learn? And then we'll give a options object to the create chatbot function, create chatbot message, excuse me, and we'll say widget options. And if we go back to our browser, now we can see that we have a new message, initial message from the chatbot, and we have different options that we can interact with. So they're not doing anything right now because we haven't implemented anything, but that's the next step. So I mentioned that we wanted to have kind of like a quiz that shows up when we click on these buttons, or maybe when we write in JavaScript or Python or Golang. We want to display the quiz component, and we want to have different questions for each component. So that's kind of the next step, and it's similar in what we need to do. Let's head back to the editor and we'll have a look. So let's have a look at the quiz component. All right, so the quiz component, basically it takes some props where we supply the question and the answers as an array. And then once we display the flashcard, you can click on that flashcard and it will switch its state to a show answer state. And if it's in a show answer state, then you can click next question until you run out of questions. So we're going to display that next. So we'll head over to our config.js and we'll add another widget. And we'll call this one JavaScript quiz. And we call the widget func. And we want to get the quiz. And we want to spread out the props. Otherwise, we won't be able to get the injected properties. Now, we want to pass props to this component. So we'll add a props object. And here we are going to put our questions. And I have the questions already on my clipboard, so I'm going to paste them in. So let's take a minute, just look at what's going on here. We've registered a new widget called JavaScript quiz, and we give it a function that is going to render the quiz component and inject it with some props. And we've given it a props object that has a questions array where each item has a question, an answer, and an ID. Perfect. So the next step now is to go back to the browser and just take a look at what we want to have happen. All right. So our chatbot initially renders a message that says, hello, what you want to learn, and some options. And what we want to have happen here is when we write in JavaScript in the input field, or we click on the JavaScript button, we want to have something happen. We want to render the JavaScript quiz that we just registered in the config. So let's go ahead and implement that. And we will go back to our editor. And we have to go to our action provider and implement this method. So in our action provider, let's create a new method called handle JavaScript quiz. And we want to create a new message that says we're going to use the create chatbot message, and we're going to say and we will pass a options object that has the property of widget and JavaScript quiz. And finally, we will pass the message and update the chatbot state. All right. So let's just go back to the browser and see if this works. Well, first we should go to the options file and see why it's going to work. So I mentioned I made this from before, and here we have hard-coded our options inside of the options component. So if you look at the handler, we are giving it a handler that's coming from props action provider handle JavaScript quiz. Now, options is one of the components that we registered as a widget in our config. And if you remember, in the config, we're giving a function that allows us to inject these widgets with props. And one of the props that we inject into the widget components is the action provider. So inside of the options widget here, we have access to the action provider, which means that we can use this handle JavaScript quiz method that we just implemented in our action provider to trigger an action in the chatbot. So if we go back to our action provider, this function right here, handle JavaScript quiz, that is the same function that we're giving as a handler in our options. So if we go back to our browser just for a second and we try to trigger an action by clicking the JavaScript icon, that works, and we get the chatbot message and we get the quiz component. Perfect. But we also want to have it trigger when we write something in, because it's a chatbot and we want the users to be able to interact with it. So we're not quite done yet. Let's head back to our IDE and we will go into our message parser. And inside of here, we are going to add a new clause, and we're going to say if lowercase includes JavaScript or lowercase includes. Again, I'm making this very simple for the case of this tutorial video, but you can go as complex as you want with this parsing. And we also have access to the action provider inside of the message parser, so we can do the same thing here. Trigger this action. Let's see if we go back to our browser. And instead of clicking, now we write JavaScript. All right, what if we write JS? Perfect. Still works. All right. Now, we've only implemented one of these quizzes, but it would be the same method you would use to implement the rest of them. You just would register them as different components and then pass in, obviously, different props. And you can do more complex things. You can create widgets that maybe you wanted to filter down to a product in a web store or something like that. There's lots of use cases that you could use for this. You could create a custom checkout process. You could probably make an entire web store in a chatbot, which would be quite interesting to see. But I'm having a lot of fun with this, and there's lots of cool little things that you can do with this. So if you enjoyed this, please let me know if there's anything you can see that should be done to improve this project. You can always file an issue on GitHub or send a pull request. And I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for tuning in.